Joe Biden, I think, very accurately described what's happening in Israel as sheer evil. And I guess one of the things that shocks me is how many folks, and let's be honest about it, on the pro Hamas left, are having a hard time recognizing this as pure evil. We're getting a lot of whataboutism, a lot of rationalizations, a lot of what about the historic context, all of this stuff. But I don't know how you look at these images coming out of Israel and just are not shocked that this is not just a moment of moral clarity, that evil is evil. This is objectively evil.
Yeah, I think there's no nuance to it. It's
No.
not complicated. There are a lot of things in this world that present difficult moral choices, and condemning the murder of civilians and babies and old people is not a complicated moral choice, Charlie. Let's be
Right.
very clear on that. Look, it's a hard thing to know. This is a very loud, very online faction of the American public. It's not necessarily a very large faction of the American public unless you happen to be on a college campus. And it's been painful to watch the inevitable, sort of polarized debates, reflexive, thinking across the political spectrum in the US. A
Yeah.
crisis like this reveals, unfortunately, a lot about the weaknesses of the system that's trying to absorb the impact of this crisis. And so we see the fault lines in Israeli society, we see the broader fault lines in the Middle East, and of course we see here in the United States our own fault lines.
Yeah.
I just want to take a step back and recognize that a terrible tragedy has taken place, and it's very important to me to sort of keep centered in that a
Yeah.
thing happened here that was a terrible thing, and then to go from there into our analysis of what it could be.
I would like to think that crises like this bring out the best in us. That used to be kind of the template, but now, as you point out, it brings out the degree of our divisions. And Tim Scott, among other Republicans, yesterday comes out and says Joe Biden has blood on his hands. I mean, this kind of extreme demagoguery, the cynicism behind this. And then you have, look, I understand that there are people who are critical of Israel. I understand that there are, legitimate differences, and the people are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. But when I see these pieces of literature being distributed on university campuses where they feature the hang gliders that the Hamas terrorists used to attack the young people at the concert, when I see this kind of imagery, or the rhetoric from some of these student groups that says that Israel alone is responsible for this, or watch the scenes from the Democratic Socialists of America rally in New York City where they're applauding and laughing about the atrocities. I mean, this is an ugly, ugly moment in our
Well, that's
our
right.
political history.
There's ugliness, in so much of politics right now, and it's hard. It's hard to watch. It's hard to watch the coverage from the ground, and as we find out what's happened. And by the way, we have not yet fully seen, I think, the full scale of the devastation. We're already over 1,200 confirmed dead, according
Yeah.
to the Israeli government. Proportionally speaking, that's well over 45,000 people equivalent in the United States. If you think about what a small country Israel is, it's the scale of the loss is enormous. Like you, I was also struck by some of the absolutely wild and overheated comments by, right-wing public officials in this country. Tim Scott, whose alleged brand
Right.
is, a
Alleged.
sort of like, oh, I'm the kindler, gentler, token guy in the Republican field, and then to just go ranting and claiming just in such a wild-eyed way that Joe Biden has blood on his hands. Joe Biden is responsible for this. Like, imagine how a Republican senator would have felt to have a Democrat go off like that on George W. Bush on September 12th, 2001. I mean, it made me feel a little bit of a, knot in the pit of my stomach, because it suggests, the opportunities for demagoguery here are so irresistible. And of
They
course,
are.
we live in this moment when demagoguery, is seen as the recipe for getting ahead in our politics as well as in Israeli politics. At any rate, that's a long prelude to saying we don't really know what's going to happen
Yeah,
on this issue. By the way, as on so many issues right now, we can talk about the war in Ukraine,
which we do.
because these are not unrelated subjects. There is a broad swath of the American people that stands with Israel, that stands with
Hmm.
Ukraine, that understands we are at a moment of international challenge to American leadership, in part because of our own internal weakness and divisions. This is a mirror of the debate happening inside Israeli society today, by the way,
Right.
where there is going to be a profound reckoning and self examination, and that is already occurring inside Israel about the extent to which that country's own internal divisions and fights over Prime Minister Netanyahu's
Yes.
efforts to reform the judiciary might have caused a very security focused society to take its eyes off of security.
I think this is such an interesting question. This whole question of, do we project weakness? What does the rest of the world think of us? What do they think of the divisions in Israel? And this is, again, there'll be time for a reckoning. But all of this rhetoric about how we look weak, which is why China is on the march, why Iran might have participated in all of this. You would wonder. This ought to shine a brighter light on other things that are going on, including the fact that we are seriously contemplating shutting down the federal government right now. Tommy Tuberville continues to put a hold on military promotions. We do not have an ambassador right now to Egypt or to Kuwait or Oman or to Israel because of Republicans in the Senate. Who are also, members of the House, Republicans in Congress, who've launched an impeachment inquiry against the commander in chief. I mean, all of these things, have to project an image of, dysfunction to much of the rest of the world, which will invite some of this. So it is interesting watching Republicans, people like Rand Paul, who tried to block Israel's, Iron Dome, to watch folks like this talk about American weakness and the projection of American weakness, I think is another reminder that irony is dead, Susan.
Well, that might be one thing we can all agree upon, Charlie. Across the political spectrum. There was a tweet from the self-styled America Firster Josh Hawley yesterday that to me summed up the stupidity of the moment. He said, "Well, because Israel faces an existential threat, we should stop all aid to Ukraine and send it to Israel." And if
that'll make us look strong,
not an existential threat of having, a few 100,000 Russians invading your country, talk about murdering babies and other atrocities, right? I mean, these are not serious people has become sort of the Logan Roy inspired anthem of our times, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about where we are at with Israel. You talked about this on Sunday on CNN. What kind of a response can we expect? Usually what happens after an attack is Israel responds with a barrage of rockets and missiles. It's not going to play out that way this time, is it? What happens next?
No, that's right. And so, it's very clear the scale of the mobilization that has been ordered up in Israel. Over 300,000 have been ordered to report to the IDF. This is a mass mobilization. There's so many people required. El Al has had to add flights around the world to bring people back into the country. That suggests a country preparing for full-scale war, not for another series of exchange of missile fire. And the indications are that some kind of ground action in Gaza is almost inevitable already. It appears that electricity has been cut off. There is something like a blockade occurring. And because Egypt also will not let the people of Gaza out on the long border that it shares with Gaza. There's a feeling that civilians, they may be warned, but there's nowhere for them to
There's
go.
no place
And
for
so
them to go. So what does all-out war look like? What does a ground war in Gaza look like? I mean, there are millions of people that live there. They are, in effect, a trap. So what would it look like? I mean, Hamas is not an army in the conventional sense. So what will this fighting be like? Urban, street to street, house to house, with terrorists in tunnels. How awful is it going to be?
That's the thing, right? That the awfulness is limited only by our imagination and our ability to think about how awful it will be. I don't know is the short answer. The somewhat longer answer is the question of to what end. And I do think that right now that is an extremely important question, because Israel has occupied and ruled over Gaza before, and essentially threw up its hands and said, this is a nightmare and we're not going to do it. And 20 years ago left Gaza. And there was an election back in 2005. That was the last time there was an election in Gaza. This is when Hamas took formal control over the strip. And, it's been a sort of a nightmare that the world has largely preferred to avert its gaze from for the last very long time. And so Israel can militarily take over Gaza. I don't think there's anybody who doubts that, although the cost could be extraordinarily high. The question is, what on earth would Israel do once it has taken over Gaza? And if you've decided that Hamas control over the territory is no longer sustainable because of the risk to Israel's security, then the question is, well, who is going to rule over Gaza? And there's been no answers. There's been no articulation of that. Just before we got on this conversation this morning, it was announced after a couple days of wrangling that Israel would form a new war cabinet, bringing in opposition to the government for the purposes of this war. So you'll have Benny Gantz, the opposition leader, former defense leader of Israel, along with Netanyahu. So they have not articulated what the war policy or the war aims of Israel are at this point. So it's very hard to talk about what is the American policy going to be, because right now, I think we're still in the initial shock phase of just standing shoulder to shoulder, showing solidarity, as President Biden did with great passion, I think, and personal commitment yesterday.
So let's talk about some of the more immediate fallout. What are the prospects of this becoming a wider regional conflict, of Hezbollah getting in other countries, missiles coming from Syria?
That's right. There is the immediate fear of that happening. And I think that's where you'll see a lot of the goal of mediation and, backstage diplomacy is trying to head that off, trying to de-escalate, or to at least to make sure that this is contained in terms of the conflict. You've already seen exchange of rocket fire in the northern borders of Israel in the last few days. There is the Iranian proxy based in Lebanon, Hezbollah, firing rockets. There is the possibility of rockets coming from Syria on Israel's northern border. That is a huge problem if you're fighting both Hamas and Hezbollah at the same time. Then there's the question of the West Bank. This is, has a completely different Palestinian dynamic there, because you have the Palestinian Authority, which have been the great rivals of Hamas so far. Abu Mazen has, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, has refused to condemn the attacks, and you haven't seen the violence spreading there yet. Of course, if that were to happen and you had another full-scale intifada at the same time, you would be talking about a very, very serious and scary escalating situation. So that's the immediate goal, I think, of everybody, is to try to dial it down and to make sure there's not a multi-front war for Israel. Right. Beyond that, though, of course, there is the question of Iran and the Gulf states, and what role everybody is going to play going forward.
So what is your assessment of the role that Iran played in this? Because there was immediately after the attack, there was that report in the Wall Street Journal suggesting that Iran was intimately involved in the planning. There's been a lot of pushback on this. Iran has been a longtime supporter of Hamas. I mean, you can't really separate out Iran from what happened over the weekend. But what's your assessment of their role? How intimately involved were they in this attack?
Well, look, that is the question. I am a believer that the truth will come out, and we will have an enormous amount of detail that we do not yet have, that will explain both this massive intelligence failure inside Israel, and how they could have been surprised by an attack like this. I have no doubt Israel has had a long tradition of inquiries after military disasters like this.
Yeah.
So hopefully there will be an accounting. And I suspect we will find that there were lots of data points that were existing inside the Israeli system in this very surveilled part of the world. And that, perhaps there was an inability to put the pieces together in ways that we will come to understand. And that will include the question of Iran's role. But you made the most essential point, Charlie. Iran has been the backer and partner of Hamas, which, by the way, has had other partners in the region. And I should point out that both Qatar and Turkey, countries that the United States has close ties with, have also maintained strong connections to Hamas over the years. But Iran has been the patron and the financial supporter. And in my experience, in your experience, you don't make a major change in your organizational model without consulting your ownership structure and your big investors. And Iran has been a big investor in Hamas. So, I suspect there will be more evidence that comes out.
So what does this do to those ongoing peace talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Does it scuttle them completely, put them on hold? What happens there?
Well, many people have wondered about that as one of the reasons and proximate timing for this attack. Certainly, one of the consequences of the Abraham Accords between Israel and Arab states in the region, such as the UAE, and now Saudi Arabia would be the big prize if you were to add them to this normalization deal, has been this notion that essentially the rest of the Arab world has moved on from the Palestinian cause, that they're willing to make a separate peace with Israel. And this does seem in some way to be an enormous and bloody challenge to that line of thinking. The idea that you can just sort of make your peace with Israel and forget about the suffering of these millions of Palestinians. And yet, it strikes me that the leaders of Saudi Arabia, in particular its Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is an extremely cynical character. And then he doesn't seem to have the emotional attachment to the Palestinian cause that his grandfather and the earlier leaders of Saudi Arabia had. So, maybe he's willing to put it on ice and then resume talks in, a certain amount of time. I wouldn't think that he cares a lot about that. And one thing that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in recent days, but that I think is very important, is that, the United States and the Biden administration have been very focused on this big sweeping vision of a new kind of security order in the Middle East, in part to guarantee Israel's security, but in part because we are looking at a new age of geopolitical competition between Russia and China and the United States. And the words China and Russia have hardly surfaced in a lot of the media coverage since this Hamas attack in the last few days, but they're not going away. And that context is a very important one for understanding the machinations in the Middle East.